I'd like to welcome everyone who is viewing the panel today, whatever day it is and whatever time of day it is around the world. It's good to have you here, and I'm pleased and honored to be the moderator for an exciting and very knowledgeable Indigenous panel from around the world. And I won't tell you their biographies, because one of the first things I'm going to do is to ask them to speak for 2 or 3 minutes about the work that they do, so you'll get to know them from their own words. Tina Ngata is in North Island of New Zealand. Welcome, Tina. And you're enjoying a much warmer climate at the moment than I am in Canada and Eastern Canada here, where it's minus 20 degrees Celsius today, so pretty cold. And also then Jessica Vega Ortega, who is in Mexico, I think in Oaxaca, Jessica, and she will also speak about her experiences in 2 or 3 minutes, like the rest of the panelists. And Tony Tenfingers in South Dakota, so you're a North American representative, and William David, also from North America, but from the part of North America that I know best, Canada. And I think you're in Ottawa at the moment. Is that right, William?
It is. It's an opportune time to just do a little sound check. Great.
Excellent. And then you came through very clearly too. And then Virginia Marshall in Sydney, the eastern side of Sydney, in eastern side of Australia. In
Southern
Sydney.
Highlands in Bowral. You'll see that on the map. Yeah, you have to come. Yes. It's a nice 15 degrees. It should be 30 degrees, but yeah, climate change. Hello. Yeah.
Yes, well, you're hiding from the from the hotspot. And then yes, and then Seferina Miss, who we will call Rena. We have that permission from her from Friday. Good to see you, Rena, from Belize. And that those are our panelists with a global perspective, and all of them with knowledge, firsthand knowledge of Indigenous culture, Indigenous knowledge holders, and ways of knowing. I must admit that I'm the sole settler here. I came to Canada 50 years ago, so I'm, as I say, I'm a settler here. So perhaps Virginia, would you mind kicking the ball off and speaking about the work that that you do in Sydney?
Yeah, well, my work is actually national and international, which is fantastic, because I get the opportunity to meet a whole bunch of people who are just as passionate as I am. I guess the most important thing about my work is that my doctoral thesis, Overturning Aquanalius, which is this one, which is my baby. After 4 years of high school, this is now my doctoral law thesis, and I'm really glad because it was so important in Australia. They commodified water, which is really, really shocking. They took away any opportunity for us to be consulted with. They haven't given Indigenous peoples of Australia management and control of water. We're actually only identified in just accounting for in native title matters and also water sharing plans. That's it. We don't have any other legislated means of really having control over and the management of our water. So Overturning Aquanalius was a big breakthrough for me, because I guess like a lot of people today, it's with climate change, you know, we know the science is settled and we don't really need to have any more information to tell us so. But also with water, we'd been telling settlers for over a couple of 100 years that they needed to really be mindful on the 60 to 80,000 years of management of this country and a beautiful system of resonating with our environment. And as Tony Tenfingers said the other day, you know, we actually are in relationships with the environment and the animals and the plants and the trees and the sky and what's beneath the water. So we have an incredible relationship as siblings, as mothers and fathers.
An enormously valuable perspective to bring to national discussion of climate change.
Absolutely.
I wonder, Jessica, if you could follow Virginia with your the kind of work that you do, and including perhaps some mention of that Global Youth Council Caucus.
Yeah, the first I want to say that the climate change is the one big issues because for the indigenous people is the pain of the Mother Earth, and then in this context, the war for try for making action needed be more global action, because if we work together for try implementation different actions in local perspectives or communities or in territory lands, this impact will impact of other region, for example. And then this sector for indigenous youth, a movement for youth people, for women, needed forcing more for working together for try for maybe make it more good effects in different social system. For example, I don't know, the implementation other technical skills, try for helping are the people, are the indigenous activists for human rights, because for example in Latin America a lot of guardians, a lot of leaders for indigenous community, they suffer attacks from different perspectives, like the maybe invasor of the territories or something, that for try for implementing different politics, and then the leaders suffer attacks, and then sometimes the indigenous people try for take protection, but some things, even when the indigenous youth try for helping at the mayors, is difficult, because the indigenous people youth not this is the one risk involved for defender at the Mother Earth, is even one risk for the life. But working together is the one option, because try for reply the message for the different regions. For example, here stay the other leaders, the other defenders, the other brothers and sisters. They can replay this message, and other governments. For example, here stay the sister from New Zealand, from North America. They can help in, they can also support together for try for action for the climate actions and for the climate change and the protection and the human defender. This is the one thing the Global Indigenous Youth Caucus try for working and empower for other voices and empower for other youth people for working in these actions.
Thanks, Jessica. That's an important view. Seferina, could you comment on about the work that you're doing in Belize, and perhaps relate a bit to Jessica and Virginia's points?
Hi, definitely. As we all know, climate change is a global issue that affects all of us, especially indigenous people most, because we are people of the land. That's how we have always seen it here as indigenous people of Belize, specifically the Maya and the Kekchi. We've always have a saying that we are children of the earth. But going back to it, it's what we're doing here is land protection. Recently, we are trying to get back. So the government said that we have rights to our land. So right now we're in the process of implementing that land right and securing our land. But it's more than just securing the land. It's all about protecting our home. This is where we live. This is where we have that symbiotic relationship with Mother Earth. She gives us food, shelter, medicine. It's right there on our doorstep. However, if we continue land concession, if we continue degrading our forests or habitat, the place that keeps us safe, then it all goes back to part whereby we are affecting the earth, which leads to the global issue of climate change. No, particularly here, we're trying to drive young people to come back and bring back what Indigenous people are, their root cause, their messaging of saying, let's protect Mother Earth, let's keep her safe in order to sustain us not just now, but for the future generation to come. Given that there's the whole educational part of it, of saying this is what land means to us, this is why we need to protect it, this is why young people now especially need to become more active and push forward protecting Earth in itself, no?
Thanks, Rena. And that must be resonating so well with you, Tony Ten Fingers.
Yes.
Tell us more.
Would you like for me to follow?
Yes, please.
Yes, okay.
Yes, please. That
Well,
was my clue.
Thank you for having me be a part of this discussion. I think, like with myself, what we call a journey in your life is that we were always in service to the people. You know, we were always in service for others. But I think one of the big issues we have today is the loss of the sacred. You know, when you look at water, water is a part of that sacred life. It provides life. There was a time when we would nourish our bodies and our spirits and our minds through the use of water. You know, when you, in those days, the natural springs held medicine that once we drank from the springs, it would nourish us. It would provide us a spirituality to a much bigger picture, what we call Changleshka Waka, the sacred circle. You know, so we're a part of the bigger picture. So I've always worked with youth growing up and growing up in different areas. I've been fortunate to be a part of a group that did nature awareness, wilderness awareness skills for young people on the East Coast, and some of these schools took off, and now they've been, some of the teachings we transplanted into some other countries in Europe and West Coast. They have nature awareness schools where a lot of the people that I mentored back then are now have PhDs in teaching in college, but utilizing a lot of the skills and the education that mentoring does for them in the world, you know. So it's for me, it's something that in our language we call it akichika, which is a messenger. We are all messengers of Creator, you know. And so when we look at the way we mentor young people, it brings out that desire to learn more about the earth and how we fit into the much bigger picture. And so I've continued to work with young people in the educational system, helping young adults who for some reason ran across issues for themselves and were not able to get a high school diploma. So I work with those people and helping them to understand what education means. And when you combine education with Indigenous knowledge, then there's something much more I don't know how to say it in English, but there's much more to it. There's a much bigger picture, and the loss of the sacred.
Sorry, you've frozen for just a moment there.
Seems to be once more find that sacredness and how we fit into that circle.
thank you. You must be very proud of the success of some of those that you've mentored. Congratulations.
Yes.
And Tina, now you've got some sense of what your other panelists do. What's your perspective on the importance of Indigenous understanding and big picture and working together, those sorts of themes that have just come up?
Well, first of all, tēnā koutou, thank you very much for having me on the panel. Yeah, my name's Tina and I come from the Ngāti Porou people on the East Cape of the Te Ika Maui, also known as the North Island of New Zealand. And I've met Virginia before at NISA. We've co-presented at NISA before, and it's lovely to see you again. And I really love the work that you've done through Equinalius. Thank you very much. It's a powerful tool for all of us. Now, our people are an ocean people. We are, we've lived on and with and traversed and voyaged across the ocean for thousands of years and collectively cared for the ocean for thousands of years as well. And while I know many people would think of us as being very far away, for us, you know, the ocean is just as much a territory as land, and there is a colonial tendency to only see land as territory. But for us, the ocean is also our collective and shared territory, and that takes me right to the doorstep of Great Turtle Island, Aotearoa as well. And so we are actually connected through water and through the ocean, and that's an issue that we have been working on as Indigenous ocean peoples as well for a number of years. We've managed to chase off 5 oil companies from our coastline, and we did that through our Indigenous networks and through our Indigenous strengths. And you know, I have to acknowledge some of the great wins over on Great Turtle Island as well, Standing Rock, and have had some huge, you know, outcomes there. And when I think about the large outcomes, the big wins against big oil and big gas, it's been Indigenous led. And so I just really wanted to acknowledge the Indigenous climate movement in that space and the wins that we've had over the years. And it's really been through, I think, both the combination of the knowledge and wisdom that our ancestors leave for us, but also, you know, an unrelenting march towards justice and an awareness that what we're facing with the water and climate crisis is not really an environmental issue. It's a human and economic issue that can be traced all the way back to the doctrine of discovery and a mentality, an exploitative mentality that was set in train all those centuries ago that still exists today in our economic and political mindsets. And so we're very versed in combating those types of mindsets, which is really what Indigenous peoples bring to the table. And I think it's also really important for us as Indigenous peoples to be able to apply that mindset to the NGO and philanthropic arena as well, to make sure that it's operating at its best potential. And so, yeah, that's a whole other discussion, I guess, to open up. But I work in the field of looking at how the doctrine of discovery manifests in environmental issues today, specifically as an ocean person as well. Tēnā koutou.
Super. Thanks, Tina. Thanks, Tina. Now then, William, from your perspective, your Indigenous perspective from Canada.
Okay, yeah, thank you. My name is William David. I'm speaking today from unceded Algonquin territory here in the nation's capital. I'd just like to acknowledge that. I myself am from Akwesasne, just only about an hour south of here, the US-Canada border bisects community. Sort of challenging to respond, only because I'm a little bit of a rambler myself. So I work right now for the Assembly of First Nations, which is a national organization that represents the 600 First Nations governments in Canada. And it's a diverse collection of groups of First Nations. At the same time, in Canada, in the past, I've worked for an organization called Inuit Stavrit Kanatami, which represents the Inuit in the Canadian Arctic. And right now I'm working as the Director of Lands, Territories, and Resources for the AFN, dealing in land rights. In the past, I've worked as a lawyer trying to advance the rights of Indigenous peoples through international human rights mechanisms or domestic ones, predominantly through the Inter-American Commission and their procedures, UN procedures, or even in US federal courts. On climate change and just in general, one of the challenges that I find Indigenous peoples face both in the rights sphere and in climate advocacy, particularly with their knowledge, is just this this real big challenge of invisibility, particularly in the face of colonialism. So the impacts are something that we often take a look at, and it's easy to examine impacts on Indigenous peoples. So for instance, in the Arctic, it's a given that the Arctic is melting and that's creating impacts. But the true effects on Indigenous peoples as Indigenous peoples of those impacts is very, very hard to understand or to remedy or to redress or to deal with without actually having a better understanding of who the Indigenous peoples are and what the relationship is to the environment around it. So over the years, I've worked on this stuff, on the science interface with Indigenous peoples, usually trying to convey to policymakers or scientists how to work with Indigenous peoples, and at the same time being able to convey to usually policymakers what the ramifications are of scientific conclusions which impact on Indigenous peoples or Indigenous traditional knowledge itself. So that's things like just explaining how something like the Arctic climate impact assessment in 2005 actually made a series of conclusions about the state of the environment in the Arctic, state of Indigenous peoples, state of knowledge. Similarly, it's doing work on First Nations related to food systems and water, which, while very heavy on infrastructure, because that's what Canadians seem to care about, is water-based infrastructure, implicated a lot of issues about the environmental sustainability of water. And frankly, in the communicating those results to First Nations, we had a lot of discussions about the relationship between the water, the individual, the community, and then all of the other environmental resources out there. I really appreciated Tony's comments about spirituality, because it's one of the things that's often really overlooked in dominant discourse. And it's hard to understate how important those kinds of impacts are and that kind of thinking is. The reason is everyone assumes that Indigenous peoples are just impacted by climate change because of this close relationship to the environment. But the reality is Indigenous peoples are simply more aware of those connections. And it's sooner or later, those environmental consequences are actually going to have severe consequences for everybody globally. We're already seeing this, even though Indigenous peoples have been concerned about this for generations now, just the impact on the environment. So the impetus is really there in terms of needing to act and needing to listen to Indigenous peoples. The only other thing that I just say, just opening, is I'm really inspired and uplifted often by how youth in particular interact with climate change. And it's just having worked at the FCCC negotiations or on domestic climate policy, the Youth Caucus and the youth in general seem to be the only collection of people that are not tied to how things are today. And how things are today is built in this country on a foundation of colonialism and injustice. So that's something that needs to be addressed. And too many people that are engaged in the system are too wedded to that system. Whereas the youth in general seem more than willing to think about the future rather than thinking about the present or the past. And that's exactly the kind of, frankly, radical thinking that Indigenous peoples don't need, that humanity and the planet really needs in order to stay viable. Thank you.
Thank you, William. Thank you. Thank you. I thought that Tina's statement about us all being connected by water was really a powerful one, and in each of you in individual ways, I think have put strength in that. I'm wondering, Virginia, especially since you and Tina have been in the same place at the same time, the same conferences, how powerfully do you think that we're all connected by water would help thinking about climate change in your country, in Australia?
Yeah, well, I really take on board what William David said about invisibility, because in Australia, We're certainly hit by the doctrine of discovery, as Tina pointed out, and we're also double hit by terra nullius and aqua nullius. So like many others across the world, you know, our youth are amazing, in spite of some areas, some pockets of Australia where there's a high suicide rate, where people are trying to deal with the hopelessness of really trying to heal the environment. Our elders are really saying that, you know, it's time that we need to deal with this. And climate change is all around us. Australia has had huge fires over the past 18 months, and it's been like a movie set. It's been devastating. So a lot of the youth have actually been really propelled in their respective areas in Indigenous ranger programs. So Sea and Ranger, much like Tina's outlined, is many people that live in coastal areas have an incredibly strong connection to country that goes way out to the horizon. I'm a lawyer with Aboriginal native title in Australia, and leading that with groups in the Bight, where of course there have been Norwegian companies that have tried to come in and extract oil. And like Tina pointed out, you know, we were able to have them leave, and that was really important, you know. So that was also a youth and elders movement. So I think that, you know, what we have to realise is that we have the answers, but many times that you go to climate change meetings, and I'm part of a whole range of advice to our Indigenous peoples organisation in Australia on these issues. And the problem is in non-Indigenous worlds, there are very few Indigenous people invited. And that's the problem. And I guess my key message the other day when I was asked is, what should you do if you're in a room where Indigenous people aren't there? And I basically said that you have to walk out. You really can't tolerate that anymore, because our elders are seeing those environmental indicators on trees that haven't flowered at all, or they're flowering too much. The stress on the environment is in the seas and the oceans. We don't have strong enough protections for waterways. There's discussion in Sydney, for example, where they want to continue mining for coal, and it's in Sydney's water catchment. And there are people from the mining industry that just say, well, that's just something we have to deal with. If it becomes polluted, well, you know, that's, you know, nothing that we can actually assist with. So, you know, I think that what people have to realise is our identity is in sea country and freshwater country. And when they impact negatively, and the we is, you know, any other non-Indigenous peoples, if they impact us negatively, it actually destroys us as a person. It impacts us and our identity. So that's what, you know, people really need to take on board, that we need to deal with that invisibility, and we need to probably talk a lot more and a lot more strongly.
Thanks, Virginia. And Rena, I think that that's a theme that you've spoken about as well with regard to your forests. Yes?
So yes, yes, precisely. Just like how our sister Virginia and Tina have a relationship with water, our one is rooted in our land, although we still take water into consideration, because we see that the water flows within us. It's in our veins, it flows in our blood, it gives life to our food. So it's, as we've always said, it's interconnected. But basically, we have a saying here it's saying Rajaj. Basically, Rajaj is saying the people of the land. That's something that you always hear, people of the land. It's people who live on the land, who work on the land, depend on the land, and most of all, taking care of the land. I think that's something that we need to keep on thinking of. As what Mr. Tony mentioned, spirits, the forest have spirits, the animal have spirit, everything have spirit. So I think when we're moving forward into saying, how do we combat climate change? I think we need to take that into consideration, that if we do want to combat climate change, we have to think of the picture of saying, how do we take care of the earth? How do we make sure that we go forward without hindering it in doing that, we need to involve our elders or Indigenous people who have that concrete knowledge of what occurs within the land. As what Virginia mentioned, that if there are no Indigenous people out there, walk out. That is something that's been repetitive. Consultations occur, conferences occur, but Indigenous people aren't included, and you can't solve climate change without Indigenous people. So that's the essence of it, bringing in the young people. Let's fight for a cause that where we know that we will protect Mother Earth. I mean, without her, you and I will not be alive. I mean, we can't go forward. Where do we get food? Right from the land. Where do we salvage fishing? Right from the ocean. So these are things that we need to start understanding now, that we need elders and young people, government agencies to come together and chart a way forward that will be sustainable, that will not harm Mother Earth in no part. I mean, that's something that needs to be looked at, I think, at the more global perspective. How do we, just as how we're having dialogue right now with different Indigenous people talking about, I think we need to have that more often and not just use us as a ticking back. Consultation with Indigenous, they came, that's not gonna work anymore. That's, as we can see, it's not working so far. So I think it's important that if we want to combat climate change, you need to bring in the people who are on the ground experiencing the reality of what's occurring.
How have you found, what ways have you found, Tina, to really be heard? Because the message that Rena has just articulated is one that I think is close to all of you. But how can you be heard? How can you you fought off 5 oil companies, but was that just because you were technically or legally or with legislation in their way, or did they really listen? Who was listening to you?
It was a multi-front. In every case, it took multiple fronts. So it took us going to the UN. It also took us defending our spaces on site. So we took our ocean voyaging canoes out to confront the vessels 250 nautical miles off our coastline. And it also took a social media presence. And it took multiple fronts to make that happen. And it also took connections. So, you know, just as has been mentioned earlier by Jessica, you know, really our solidarity in this space is so powerful, but also our connection, you know, as Tony had mentioned earlier, you know, when we you know, our ocean canoe is a tiny, you know, size of a tiny pinprick next to these huge, great big floating cities of seismic surveying vessels and oil extraction vessels. But when we connect to the ocean, who is our ancestor, and everything that lives in it, which is our relation, then we dwarf that other vessel by virtue of our spiritual and genealogical Indigenous relationships to all that's around us. And when we join our voices up similarly, you know, the global Indigenous village is a huge powerhouse when we come together in solidarity and lobby for a particular outcome. But, you know, I want to say this isn't just about rights, it's also about just the outcomes that are required. And this is not really also about doing Indigenous peoples any favors. You know, the climate movement needs to realize that, you know, apart from, I think, the well-known fact now that we hold 80% of the world's biodiversity in our territories, and we have sequestered 33 times the global carbon emissions in Indigenous managed forests. You know, we get, and that's before you even consider the carbon sequestration that happens in Indigenous managed oceanic systems as well. So we have demonstrably, you know, been able to advance good climate outcomes. And either the carbon, it's not about doing favors, either the climate movement gets that or they lose. That's really what it comes down to. And so there's no carbon, you know, climate justice without Indigenous justice. And so we really need to be also focusing on the role that Indigenous justice plays in good climate outcomes.
Yeah, that's powerful. That's powerful. Jessica, you were the first, I think, who spoke so strongly about working together. do you see working together as being a way to be heard, to be more, to raise the power of your voice, and especially through that Global Youth Council? Is that a way of bringing power to your voice?
Yes, I think the more important now for working together is because it's not only the problem, the climate change for the indigenous people, is for the global situation, is the take action together. Indigenous are not indigenous people, because if we're not working together, it's really difficult. See, looking for the life for the next generation, for example, and then needed commitments for healthcare, for management toxic waters, for territory security, because for the indigenous people, when the lost one river, for example, is the loss, the culture, is the loss, the people, is the loss, the territory, traditional knowledge, is love all for the indigenous people. It's not only the dry one river, is the dry all the spiritual connection, is the drive all the culture, and the maybe for the next generation is don't have possibility for not about who I am, is your identity, where are you from, and then is the one care for the indigenous people, and that needed working for recognizing the contribution for the indigenous people, for the communities, and then not try for respect all the natural resources in the territory and lands, because the indigenous people, they are the more protecting people. 18% the territory and lands is a part for the one community, and they are guarantees of the life. And then needed try for a proposal and replicant traditional forms, traditional knowledge, and other space, not only in communities, territories, also in urban areas, for example, because the traditional knowledge can help it at the cities, for example, in the traditional food systems, traditional adaptation practice, small action activities. We cannot change the climate, but we can change the system. This is the good option, recognizing the caring for the environment and the caring of the lives. This is the thing. This is important because the indigenous people and non-indigenous peoples live here in the Mother Earth. We need working together for helping on the Mother Earth and the protecting on the Mother Earth and the protecting the traditional knowledge and the protecting the people indigenous.
Thanks, Jessica. We're coming to the point where we probably should be trying to put together what our key messages are. I think some of them are emerging. And Tony, if you were to reflect on what you've heard and the importance of working together and the importance of being heard, who do you target in South Dakota as being the key people that you need to be working with, and the key people that you need to have listening to you?
Well, in the indigenous communities, we lost a lot of elders because of the pandemic, and so we don't have that resource. We lost a lot of them in Oglala, and at this point, you look at elected leaders, you look at state governments, and state governments have always been at odds with indigenous governments because of the history of how this country developed over the years. So there's always there's always conflict because we see things differently. Whereas they may see water for creating profit, bottling, selling water, huge farms, corporations tapping in on the aquifer to water their plants so they can make a profit. So they see things differently than we do. So I think we have to bridge that understanding of both worlds in some way, because they are the decision makers. They are the elected leaders. And sometimes what we're saying, they fear what we say. They don't want to understand it because they see us as, like when you go back to the history of the doctrine of discovery, you go back to that, you would see that they saw us as uncivilized. When you go back and learn about Indigenous people, we had so much knowledge and science behind what we learned about nature, how the natural process works. And so I think there's got to be a bridge that needs to be built between how we see the world and how state governments, federal governments see the world, and something I called the accumulation culture in the United States, where you accumulate, and that seems to be their driving force. And so, whereas we try to maintain a balance with our natural world. So I think like people do come to the table and listen for us to be heard. And I think with some of the Canadian Indigenous people utilizing a lot of the Indigenous methodologies and bringing it into a scientific world where the people in power can understand. Because here in America, the people in power are elected leaders. And for some reason, they fear Indigenous culture, because Indigenous traditions, Indigenous views of the world, where we're trying to maintain a balance and actualize a balance with the natural world. For some reason, they have that fear of that. So,
thanks, Tony. So how do we build that? How do we build that bridge? William, have a go. You just heard that Canadians are maybe ahead of South Dakota.
Well, parts anyways. And I mean, it really does reflect on what a lot of others have already said. There's just no one single way to do it, in the sense that you have to use a combination of strategies, approaches, and tactics. First and foremost, it's just like building greater understanding and for instance, understanding of fairly basic concepts that for someone like me seem almost reflexive. But when you think about, for instance, water being a powerful medicine, you know, if you misuse or mistreat a medicine, it comes back to hurt you. Like that to me just seems like a logical thing that a lot of people don't really seem to have a grasp on. It always confuses me because, for instance, like narcotics are medicines, right? Alcohol is often used as a medicine. People abuse those things and then it comes back and it hurts them. So it just seems like something that's really borne out and logical, but there's a whole string of things that for a lot of Indigenous peoples are probably pretty axiomatic that I think a lot of others just don't understand. And building understanding is a thing. Political action is a really big thing in Canada in particular that has worked out fairly well, although again, sometimes you have good politics, sometimes you have really bad politics. If you don't have the understanding, and first and foremost, you really can't get anywhere with the good or with the bad. And then most important, especially here, is the ability to challenge the underlying power structures that are out there. And those power structures are not just things like, you know, some government has compulsory power over me. It's not just things like there's a whole framework of laws out there. I mean, okay, so I'm a lawyer, so I have to work in, like, you know, the English Canadian legal system, right? Like, it's not just that system's out there and that Indigenous laws are really not recognized. We can work on that. It runs much, much deeper in terms of really challenging a lot of the underlying assumptions that we have about the way that society has to be structured. Like, even basic things like, you know, I have a stapler, like, this came from somewhere and there's a cost to it. And it's not something that's just like you put a number on it and then there's a dollar amount. Like, somebody somewhere had to destroy somebody's food source in order to mine the stuff that went into that stapler. It's a very, very real cost. And to a certain extent, and I mean, I don't like thinking like this, it keeps me up at night, but by using the stapler, you can then become complicit in somebody else's oppression. That's something that we as a global community really have to get a grip on, in terms of like really understanding what the implications are if we are all connected and we are all related to each other. And it does make, again, a huge difference just in terms of how you approach, say, constituency work in the FCCC. For example, right? Like, it's really helpful for me to be able to work with, say, the gender constituency or the youth constituency or trade unions, really to try to emphasize the fact that we are in fact all connected, that I can't get anywhere with Indigenous rights or climate change and Indigenous peoples unless we bring others along. And some of those conversations, I know I've been in too many of them myself, are remarkably difficult, particularly, for instance, with environmental NGOs. But at the same time, unless you can actually get them to understand and start to bring them along, the whole issue just doesn't seem to move anywhere. And that's, if I could say, the one thing that characterizes the greatest frustration I have in this area in particular, is the short-sightedness of people that are, you know, my age and older, combined with the fact that people really don't seem to want to relate to each other. So it's really hard to get member states, to actually have an open discussion and have the degree of empathy and understanding for each other that it takes to actually resolve the issue. It's almost like they're more interested in what they define as their own interests, without the understanding that their interests are inexorably intertwined, and that time is running out much more quickly than they realize.
Thanks, William. Tina, that must have all been music to your ears. And
yeah, absolutely, absolutely support everything that that one was just saying. But you know, and I guess the only other thing that I would add is that most people and most leaders like to consider themselves just people. And there's a saying that I think was made popular by Martin Luther King, and then more recently by Barack Obama, that the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. And so I think, you know, for us, we need to continually hold the mirror up to these power systems and point out, you know, where actual justice really lays, and what justice really looks like. And then continually point out that without Indigenous justice, there will be no climate justice, and there will be no climate wins for any of us. And so, you know, I think those are some really important steps for us to build those bridges and work together, but work together with a clear vision of what justice looks like. And definitely we need to be challenging some of those, particularly, I mean, all stages and levels, but those global power systems really do need to shift. So much of this exists in a transnational space and exists at a global level, and then filters down to local outcomes. And so we really need to be challenging it at those larger levels as well.
And I think that's what we do in Australia. We've really learned from our brothers and sisters in Canada too, is that we talk about truth telling in Australia and Indigenous peoples. We're really pushing that, and we're pushing the treaties, and we've learned again from Canada and from the US and the historic treaties, but truth telling underlies that now. And that's what we're talking about more and more in the UPR recommendations that we drafted in the report card to Australia. Truth telling is the big thing. Take away the political spin just be bare, you know, and really own what you have done and what you continue to do. But the truth-telling element for us is really powerful.
Thank you all so much. We've come to the end, I think, of the 45 minutes they've allowed for us. I'd love to bring you all back and have a sort of a different question that maybe starts with, how do we build the bridge, and where are the signs of hope? Because this is such a huge challenge. We need signs of hope in order to feel that it's possible to carry on with some vision of a better future.